Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. Today we're doing a video which is slightly different to what you are usually used to, and it's based around Wargame Red Dragon. Now, if you don't know what Wargame Red Dragon is, it's basically an RTS, which is an incredibly fun game based around the ideas of modern conflict from the 70s to pretty much the 90s. It's a game which has been around for a very long time, and they constantly update it with new factions and also new scenarios. And one of the factions that is coming up into the game on the 30th of September is the South Africans. And I got chatting to some of the South African guys that we worked with when it came to looking at the South African Tech Tree project, and it turns out they were also involved in helping get South Africa to Wargame Red Dragon. So I was able to sit down with Captain Blackjack, who was the vehicle consultant for this expansion of the game, basically around the ground forces, and then also some of the testing team, which you may have heard before. We have Rattle, Skim, and also Griffin along with us. So in this video, we categorize all of the different vehicles and infantry members that are coming to Wargame Red Dragon on the 30th of September for South Africa. I hope you enjoy it, and enjoy the video.
Alright, so the first infantry which is available for the South African DLC is the P10 from the UNITA squads. They're armed with a single 82mm heat rocket, the Recall rifle, and they are pretty standard for normal fire support infantry. Next up is the Bokop. They're your standard line infantry, armed with a Vector R1, South African license produced FNFL, RPG-7, which is very uncommon for Blue 4 nations, and also the Bren L4. Just hold on. Oh, sorry, my chair just almost broke. Next up is the Buffaloes. These are representing the 32 Battalion, which was Africa's second most decorated battalion in the SADF. They are shock infantry, also classed as your light infantry, 15-man squads, and they are pretty deadly. Armed with the Portuguese G3, the RPG-7, and the HK-21. Next up is the Burgermacht, which is the reservists, and Burgermacht means citizen force. 15-man squads for reservists, which is pretty good, with a Vector R1 and just a super bazooka, because why not? Next up, Mech-Inf, which means mechanized infantry. They are your shock infantry, your normal rifle shock infantry, armed with the Vector R1, LRAC F1, and the FN Mag. They come in various transports such as the Rattles, Rattle 20, Rattle 90, etc., etc. Then you have the South Africa's only dedicated anti-tank teams, the Milan teams. They only have the Milan F1, not the F2 or the F3. So they're not the best, but they're at least something, armed with the R1 as well. Next up is the Parabats, but I will be giving them over to Skim.
The Parabats are South Africa's airborne forces. They are known as Parabats in South Africa. Parabats is an abbreviation for Parachute Battalion. They are armed with Vector R2s, which is essentially a folding stock FEL. They are also armed with a RPG for anti-tank, as well as a FN Mag machine gun. They are also shock infantry, so they're really good against other infantry units, and they can either be transported in a Buffalo, a Casper Mark II, a Casper KK, Puma, or Oryx. And I'll give it over to Rattle again.
Okay, Sappers, the normal flamethrower infantry for the South Africans. They use the normal Lifebuoy, armed with the other one as well. Come in various transports such as Buffalo, Rattles, and also the Puma. Next up is the SASF, South African Special Forces, which I will give over to Skim.
Right, this is the SASF. They are known as Reckies in South Africa. They are armed with a Vector R5, which is the South African license-produced copy of the Galileo SAR. They also have a LRAC F1, which is a 84mm heat launcher. That's for anti-tank. And they're also armed with a Strela, which is for anti-air purposes. They have elite training, so they are the best of the best that South Africa's infantry has to offer. Now I'll give over to Rotterdam again.
All right. So South Africa's anti-air infantry, they have the Strela 2, which is just normal infantry, armed with R1, and the Strela 2M. Fairly average, nothing too impressive from them, but they can do the job. Next up, for this era, we have the buff for the 1985s. We have the Buffalo 85s. Now, this is a really powerful unit, armed with an AKM, a long-range anti-tank weapon, and a machine gun. The start of the show is the long-range anti-tank weapon, the Milan F1. Even though it's not the best Milan, having a 15-man squad shock infantry with a very long-range anti-tank weapon is a beast of a unit. So I would be really worried if I come across these guys on the battlefield. They come in various transports, such as the Kaspers, all of them. Not the Rattles, though. Next up is the Inflict, and this is a really special unit. Basically, not the same as a B-10. It is a 1 of 7mm MR multiple rocket launcher tube, single tube which they used to fire shells at a range of 1,925 meters in-game. So far in-game, this is the longest range for any fire support unit in the game. And their HE is 4, which is pretty high for the caliber. So these units I would prefer to be used in defensive roles, which would annihilate infantry at long range. Next up is the Strela 3 for South Africa's air defense units. They captured these Strela 3s from Fapla during the border war, and that is how we got them to our disposal. They also used the Vector R4. All right, now the 1990s variants. Next up is the Bokop 90. They come equipped with the Vector R4, the FT5, and the FNMAC. The FT5 is a really, really good anti-tank weapon, 700 meter range, 60% accuracy, and 23 AP. Say goodbye to your super heavies if you come across Bokop 90. Next up is MechInf. Same as the Bokops, they come with the Vector R5, FT5, and differently the SS77. They are your MechInf, so which means they're also your shock infantry, which means better watch out of your own infantry when you come across these guys. Parabats and the Special Forces, I'll give over to Skim for now.
Right, so as the name suggests, this is the Parabats in the 1990s configuration. One thing I actually failed to mention previously is that these Parabats are wearing the giraffe camo, which is a camo they tested with, but it was never fielded. And the interesting thing to note is actually one of the rarest camouflage patterns in the world. They are armed with a Vector R5. Like I previously mentioned, it's a Galil SAR copy. They also have the FT5 rocket launcher, which is a locally produced launcher, and as Rattle said, it's really good. They also have a SS77 machine gun for suppression purposes, and they again have shock training, so they're shock infantry. And next up, we have the Rekis, or the SASF90 in the 1990s configuration. They're armed with the Vector R5. They have the Apilas launcher for anti-tank purposes, as well as its Stinger for anti-air purposes. And then I'll give over to Rotom again.
Okay, the last infantry unit which South Africa has at its disposal is the Stingray from UNITA. Interestingly, during the border war, UNITA was the only Angolan revolution still alive fighting against Fapla. Being that they were just a bunch of guerrillas, even though they were supplied by the Americans with Stinger missiles, which were very advanced for their time, they needed the South Africans to help them and assist them, which is basically what happened during the Battle of the Lomba in 1987. That is why you would see this UNITA squads in the South African DLC fighting alongside the South Africans to crush the communist enemies once again.
Moving to support, but before we continue, a quick disclaimer. The version we are looking at now is still 2 weeks away from completion. You will see some stat cards and icons not complete yet, but they will be done by the 30th. We're also not going to look at all the units. There's 1 or 2 which still need to be remodeled, but for reference purposes, we are very glad to do this video. Now the Cactus, we just quickly change the era. Looking at the first anti-aircraft missile launcher vehicle available is the Cactus, which is a copy of the French or licensed version of the French Curtale. Then you have the Cactus SAHV. This is a infrared missile. And then lastly, you have the cream of the crop for the South Africans, the Reconnaissance ZETA HVM. It can keep pace with the reconnaissance vehicles as well as the anti-tank vehicles, which makes it perfect for close support for those units. Additionally, you have the Eland 60 available for indirect fire. You have the venerable Ratel 81, which carries 150 mortar bombs and can shoot 18 of these a minute. Using these in squad is fantastic. Ratel 20 is an upscaled version of 120mm mortar bomb. We have the generic Rover 107, which can fire napalm rounds. Then you have the South African Valkyrie, which is an onset to the BM-21 supplied by the Soviets to FAPLA. It has a longer range, given that it has a bigger diameter tube, and it carries 24 rockets. The cream of the crop for MRLs for South Africa is the Battalier, which is uses the exact same type of rockets on a mine-proof chassis, and it's armored. This is in-game modeled as having AP damage, whereas the Valkyrie has HE damage. For artillery, South Africa has available to it the Sexton, which is a remnant of the Second World War units that we used. But on the opposite side of the scale is the G645 Rhino, which is, as far as my knowledge goes, the artillery vehicle with the longest range in game, 39.9 kilometers. If I am correct, it can literally shoot from one end of the map to the other. And you will also notice that its dispersion is very, very small. I'm not going to look at the Eystervark because the model is not complete yet. Looking at the Bosvark, which is an upgrade to the Eystervark, it carries twin-barrel 23mm guns for anti-aircraft and helicopter, but it can also be used in the ground role, very good at suppressing infantry. It has quite a long range for anti-helicopter use, especially from concealed positions. And then lastly, the cream of the crop for the anti-aircraft guns is the Reconnaissance ZA35, which can keep pace with the other Ratels, perfect for fire support in anti-aircraft, anti-helicopter roles, suppressing them while escorting the faster anti-tank vehicles. Okay, moving to the tank tab.
Right. First up, we have the Logum, which is South Africa's most sophisticated main battle tank in game. Logum was the project name to design and build a locally produced main battle tank. It is armed with a locally produced LEW 120mm main gun, and it also has a MG4 for anti-infantry purposes. And the interesting thing to note, it's very stats-wise, it's very comparable to the German Leopard 2A4. Then next up, we have the Olifant Mark I, which is the first iteration of the Olifant. This is basically the starting MBT for South Africa. Then next up, we have the Olifant Mark 1A. It is armed with a 105mm main gun and also has a Browning MG4 for anti-infantry purposes. The Olifant Mark 1A does have better AP power because it does have better main gun rounds. Then next up, we have the Olifant Mark 1B, which is armed with a 105mm main gun. It also has an arm improvement over the Olifant Mark 1A. And then next up, we have the Olifant Mark 1B Optimum. The Olifant Mark 1B Optimum is essentially the same as the Olifant Mark 1B, except for better armor and more sophisticated rounds, AP power. And next up, we do have the Reconnaissance 76, which is a tank destroyer for South Africa. It is armed with a 76mm main gun. It also has a Browning MG4 for anti-infantry. purposes. Then next up, we have the Roycat 105, which is an upgraded Roycat 76 armed with a 105mm main gun. Also has a Browning MG4 for anti-infantry purposes. Now I'll give it over to Diebold for recon.
Yeah, I would like to mention that these Roycats are extremely fast off-road and they are perfect for flanking maneuvers. Okay, moving to the Reconnaissance tab. These vehicles or equipment has better optics for spotting enemy vehicles and units. First up for the South Africans is the Alouette 3. It has no defensive armament. Ground vehicles is the Eland 90 with better optics. Then you have the Eland 19 intact with 2 anti-tank missile launchers on the side of its turret. And then you have the Roycat 76 Reconnaissance, which has both the speed, mobility, and optics to make life very difficult for opposing team. Handing over the Paras for explanation.
Right, so we have the Para Pathfinders. They are the recon wing of South Africa's airborne forces. Even though they are recon infantry, they still have shock training, which means that they are really good against other infantry units that they might encounter. They are armed with a R4, which is the South African license-built copy of the Galil. They also have a Y2 40mm grenade launcher, as well as a HK21 MG. They can either be transported in the SAML 50, the Buffalo, the Casper Mark II, the Casper K-Car, or in the Puma, or in the Oryx. And now I will hand it back over. Oh. And then next up, we have the South African Special Forces sniper team. They are a two-man team. They consist of one guy being armed with a Vector R5. And interesting to note, they also are armed with the NTW-20 anti-material rifle, which is built and designed in South Africa. This sniper team is not only good against infantry, but they're also very good against lightly armored vehicles. Right, I will hand over to Diebold.
There's a generic rover vehicle available, and then we get to the South African tracking units. They come with several types of vehicles available, SAML 50, Biffle, Casper, and the usual mix. These are very good units because they're very good stealth and they have very good optics. So using them in the front line, spotting and identifying enemy units. Lastly, we have available the XH-1 Alpha, which is a helicopter built by South Africa to test its industrial capability for developing helicopters. This would be the lineage where the Royfolk comes from. It's armed with a 20mm, and it's a somewhat better option than the Oryx 3, which we saw at the beginning, but it has a bit less optical capability, but it can defend itself. Moving to the vehicles. First up, these vehicles are standalone. They don't come with infantry, and some of these are just for reference purposes. You have the standard Biffle, the Casper K. Units we haven't seen before in the other tabs is the Ferret intact with the same anti-tank missiles previously seen, as well as a Mark II variant with a Milan F1. Then you have the South African Ratel ZETA, which carries the Swift missile, very good fire and armor piercing power and range, as well as accuracy. These are not to be used in the front line. They work best from the ambush positions and then pulling them back. You also have the Ratel 20 available, the 20 with a Milan, as well as the 60, the 90 as a fire support variant as well. Specifically talking about this one, the camouflage pattern is a bit different on this one. This is homage to the 32 battalion and the camouflage they used in with their fire support vehicles. You also have a Ferret Mark II 106 as well as a Rover 106. And just for reference purposes, you have the SAML 50 for logistics. Moving to the helicopters, you have the Alouette K, which has a 20mm sight gun. You have the Puma also for reference purposes, as well as the Oryx if you want to look at the models. For combat use, you have the XTP-1 Beta 87, which has two pairs of 68mm rockets, as well as infrared locally manufactured Kukri anti-aircraft missiles or anti-helicopter missiles. Does have limited anti-plane capability. Next up is the XTP-1 Beta, which is armed with single rocket pods, and the Ingwe ZT-3A2, which has longer range and better armor piercing than its Swift counterpart. And top of the line for South Africa, you have the Rooivalk combat support helicopter with its 20mm nose gun, same as the one used at the Ratel 20. You have the ZT-3A2 Ingwe anti-tank missiles. You have 8 of them, and then you have two pairs of Mistral anti-aircraft, anti-helicopter missiles for self-defense.
I would like to mention that with the helicopters, the Alouette K-Car, even though it may not be the best helicopter in practice, historically this helicopter was used a lot by the South African Air Force in South Africa's counterinsurgency operations, hunting down SWAPO terrorists and even attacking SWAPO bases inside Angola. These Alouette K-Cars played a huge role in South Africa during the border war.
Okay, next up we have the Buccaneers. SAF would purchase 16 of these Buccaneers and would form part of 24 Squadron. The RAF and the SAF would be the only operators of these aircraft. The Buccaneer would also be used to great success during the border war conflicts. The SMK-50 Buccaneer in Wargame is equipped with no less than 4 AS-50 anti-tank missiles to provide a devastating punch to armored units. Of course, next up we have the Carver. Now the Carver prototype is a never-produced, fully domestic South African design, planned with all the optics and engine improvements from the Cheetah series and the better ECM. The fighter deploys with 2 long-range V4R Darter missiles as well as 2 U-Darters. It also features the latest version of the V3 series of missiles, bringing improved accuracy and damage to the airspace of Wargame. Following is the Sabre, the Canadair Sabre. These Sabres would serve with both 1 and 2 Squadron, the South African Air Force. The Sabre in Wargame will be armed with 2 18 rocket pods, which is of 68mm, and these are SNEP rockets. It also features 6 x 12.7mm Browning machine guns in the nose. Following is the Impala Mark II, which is based on the Italian Airmaghi MB326K, built under license by South Africans. This plane features twin 30mm DEFA guns in the nose and fielding 68mm SNEP rocket pods, twice as many as the Sabre.
All right. Firstly, for South African air supremacy fighters, or the Mirages, this time we have the Cheetah D. The South African SEED aircraft, suppressing enemy air defense aircraft. It is armed with 2 twin DEFA 50mm cannons, 2 Barb anti-radiation missiles, and then 2 V3C Darter missiles. One thing to note is this is the only SEED aircraft in the game which works with HE damage. This is right. All the American AMRAAMs, the HARMs, all of them, the Shrikes, they all work with AP power. This is the only one that works with HE power. And you can even use them as normal laser-guided bombs if you really feel like it. So this Cheetah D would be a really nice welcome to the game. Next up, we have the Mirage 3CZ. South Africa acquired the Mirage 3Cs during the 1960s and 70s. This one is armed with 2 V3A Kukri missiles, locally produced air-to-air missiles, and then 1 R550 semi-active radar missile. Next up we have the Mirage F1CZ with the same camo pattern used during the 1980s in the border war. This one is armed with 6 V3B Kukri missiles. This is one dangerous aircraft, 20% ECM, and 6 missiles is quite a force to be reckoned with. Next up, we have the Cheetah C. Now, this is just another Cheetah, which South Africa used to upgrade their Mirage Free Fleet to the Cheetah model. This one is armed with 2 twin depth 50mm cannons, 2 V3C darter missiles, and then 2 V4R darters. The R darters are basically the Israeli copy of the Derby, and it can basically be described as an AMRAAM. Next up, we have the Mirage 3 EZ. Now, the EZ is just normal Mirage 3E, but this one is armed with a single AS-30 anti-tank missile, or it can only be used against tanks in the game. Modeled with 30 AP, if it hits something, it's dead. Say goodbye to your tank. Even though the accuracy and stabilizer is a bit low, it can get the job done. Next, we have the Cheetah E, which is just another Cheetah, but the E model armed with 8 Mark 82 bombs and then 2 V3B Kukri missiles. Quite a decent aircraft, I must say, with 30% ECM, not bad. Next up, the Cheetah D2. Now, this is just a different variation of the Cheetah D, carrying 2 Mark 83 Griffin laser-guided bombs, and then 2 V3C darted missiles. Fairly similar to the Cheetah D, carrying the barbs, but just instead of barbs, it has laser-guided bombs.
Continuing on to the Vampire, we have the B-52, which is an export version of the FP6. This Vampire carries 2 Mark 77 napalm bombs, features 4 20mm Hispano cannons nose. It also features a nice skin from the 85 Combat Flying School of the South African Air Force. Finally, we have the Canberra. During the course of the border war, the Canberras was used for bombing and reconnaissance missions. The Canberra in Wargame has a load of 8 Mark 83 500 kilogram bombs for some serious bush war carpet bombing.
Thank you, and that concludes our presentation.
I'd just like to thank Professor X 1718, Orange Tail, Sakoshi Tiger, BRFC 15, Teddy, John Ryman, Universe A, Eugens Terry, Ambrosius McClellan, Daniel Stanton, Martinez, B. Young, and then Kyle Kin, Barine, Lafouche, and also Samuel Slick for supporting the channel.